That was the part that made Clara Voss's hands go still. Not the forgery itself, not the lies layered beneath expensive pigment and aged varnish, but the fact that somewhere in this palace, a man had already pressed his seal into warm wax and handed another family's future to the wrong people. She stood in the East Gallery of Whitmore Palace, alone, at 20 minutes past 6 in the morning, holding a magnifying lens she had carried in her coat pocket for 11 years. The painting before her, a formal portrait of Lord Aldrich Fenmore, 3rd Earl of Castlemaine, dated 1847, was hanging exactly where it had always hung. Gold frame, dignified posture, the slight tilt of the chin that noble families always requested from their portraitists, as if looking slightly upward at the world was a birthright rather than an instruction. But the brushwork around the left cuff was wrong, not obviously wrong, not wrong in the way that would make a minister or a lord or a royal advisor stop and frown. Wrong in the way that only someone who had spent a decade studying the specific vocabulary of Victorian portraiture would recognize. The way a particular painter signed his work, not with his name, but with the way he loaded his brush at the start of a session, always heavier on the left, always pulling the stroke inward toward the subject's center. This painting had been loaded from the right. Someone had copied the original, copied it well, copied it with patience and skill and the kind of deliberate care that only comes when the stakes are very high. Clara lowered her lens. She had been called to Whitmore Palace 3 days ago to verify the Fenmore family's land claim. A formality, she'd been told. The portrait was part of the historical record. It confirmed lineage, confirmed title, confirmed that the Fenmore family had occupied Castlemaine estate since the middle of the 19th century. A parliamentary committee had requested authentication before finalizing a boundary dispute that had dragged through the courts for 2 years. She had almost said it was authentic. She had almost written the 3 sentences, signed her name, folded the paper, and handed it to the clerk waiting outside the gallery door. But she had looked one more time. She always looked one more time. And now she was standing in an empty gallery at 20 past 6 in the morning, knowing something that could destroy a family, or save one, and understanding with complete clarity that the moment she spoke, nothing in this building would remain the way it was. The clerk was still outside. The committee would convene at 9. Clara Voss straightened her coat, picked up her satchel, and began to think. The Palace of Whitmore was not, technically, a royal residence. It functioned as the administrative heart of the Crown's cultural affairs, the Ministry of Collections, as some called it, though no such formal name existed. It was the place where England's artistic heritage was catalogued, disputed, loaned, returned, and occasionally lost, and it was staffed by a precise hierarchy of curators, archivists, restoration specialists, and the various clerks and assistants who existed to ensure that papers moved from one desk to another with the appearance of purpose. Clara had worked within that hierarchy for 3 years. She held the title of Senior Authenticator First Class, a designation that sounded impressive until one understood that there was no second class, that the title had been invented specifically to give her a function without giving her authority, and that her recommendations were treated as technical opinions rather than decisions. The decisions were made by the Curatorial Council, 5 men of varying age and identical disposition, none of whom had ever held a magnifying lens over a canvas in their professional lives. She did not resent them. Resentment required energy she preferred to spend on her work. Her office was on the 3rd floor, northeast corner, which meant the morning light came in at the precise angle she needed, and the afternoon sun never bleached her reference materials. She had arranged this deliberately, over 6 months of careful scheduling, by volunteering to take the office no one else wanted, because the radiator made a sound like a small animal trying to escape from inside the wall. She had fixed the radiator herself, in January, using instructions from a plumbing manual she had borrowed from the palace library. That was, in small measure, who Clara Voss was. She was 31 years old. She had studied art history at a time when women in the field were tolerated as enthusiasts and employed as exceptions. She had published 2 papers on Victorian portraiture, under initials rather than her full name, because her first submission under CVOS had been returned with a note suggesting she might want to have a male colleague review her methodology before resubmitting. She had not resubmitted. She had sent it to a different journal, where it had been accepted within 2 weeks and cited 14 times in the following 3 years. None of this was known to the Curatorial Council. What they knew was that she was reliable, quiet, and correct, in that order of importance. The forgery she had found that morning was not the first irregularity she had encountered in Whitmore's collection. 18 months earlier, she had flagged a misdated landscape that had turned out to be a minor accounting error. An honest mistake, quickly corrected. 8 months before that, she had identified a misattributed drawing that changed its estimated value by a significant but unremarkable amount. This was different. This was a document being used as legal evidence in a property dispute involving 1,200 acres of Northumberland countryside, a railway right-of-way that 3 separate commercial interests were competing for, and a noble family, the Fenmores, who had occupied Castervane Estate for 4 generations, and were at this moment entirely unaware that the portrait meant to prove their right to stay there was not the painting their ancestor had commissioned. Someone had replaced it, and someone had done it recently enough that the varnish, though artificially aged, had not yet developed the specific network of hairline fractures that came only with genuine time. Clara spent the first hour of the morning documenting everything she observed. She worked methodically without haste, filling 6 pages of her notebook with measurements, notations, and small precise sketches of the areas of concern. She photographed the canvas with the portable camera she kept in her satchel, another object considered unnecessary by the council, and therefore, in their minds, her personal eccentricity rather than a professional tool. By 8 o'clock, she had everything she needed. By 8:15, she understood exactly what would happen if she handed her findings to the Curatorial Council. The Council would refer the matter to the Parliamentary Committee. The committee would appoint a review board. The review board would take between 6 and 10 weeks to convene. In the meantime, the original committee would proceed on schedule, because the legal mechanism did not pause for cultural disputes. The Fenmore family would lose their claim before anyone had finished reading her report. She needed to go somewhere else first. The question was where and who in this palace, in this particular morning, in this city full of people with reasons to look away, would actually listen. She was still considering this when she stepped into the corridor outside the East Gallery and found it no longer empty. A man was standing at the far end of the hall. He was not moving. He was not inspecting anything. He was simply present in the way that very few people manage to be, as though the space around him had reorganized itself slightly to accommodate the fact of him. Clara had never seen him before, but she recognized the way the 2 attendants near the corridor entrance had gone quiet. She recognized the way they were looking at the floor. His name, she learned within the hour, was Edmund Ashford. She learned it not because he introduced himself, he did not, but because after he had walked past her with nothing more than a glance that lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate, the clerk who had been waiting outside the gallery materialized at her elbow and said, in a tone that mixed reverence with poorly concealed anxiety, that His Grace the Duke of Windermere had arrived early for his 9 o'clock appointment with the council. Clara filed this information the way she filed everything, quietly, in the correct mental folder for later use. She had heard of Edmund Ashford. Everyone in any building that touched the intersection of art, property, and English law had heard of Edmund Ashford. He was the kind of man whose reputation preceded him not through gossip. Gossip required warmth, required the speaker to lean in and lower their voice, but through a kind of civic transmission, the way people learn about weather systems or changes in legislation. His family held one of the oldest dukedoms in England. He sat on 4 separate advisory boards related to Crown land, cultural heritage, and parliamentary oversight. He had 3 years ago personally halted the sale of a Flemish altarpiece to a private buyer in Vienna by presenting a counter-documentation case that had taken the legal team on the other side 11 months to abandon. He had never, as far as Clara knew, lost an institutional argument. He was also reportedly entirely uninterested in the feelings of anyone who disagreed with him. She decided this was not her concern. What was her concern, at 8:47 in the morning, was that the Parliamentary Committee's session began in 13 minutes, that her completed authentication report was due at the start of that session, and that she had not yet decided what to do. The honest version of her report would halt the proceedings. It would also expose her to immediate institutional pressure. The council did not welcome complications, and a complication of this scale, days before a high-profile committee vote, would be understood by certain people as a problem Clara Voss had created rather than discovered. The alternate version, the one where she wrote 3 careful sentences, signed her name and handed the clerk a document that confirmed the painting's authenticity, would be professionally safer, temporarily. It would also be wrong in every sense she was capable of applying to the word. She had known what she was going to do since approximately 6:25 that morning, when she had stood in the gallery with a still lens and a very clear mind. She had spent the subsequent 2 hours not deciding, but preparing. She walked to the committee room on the 2nd floor and knocked. The clerk who opened the door looked surprised. Clerks at Whitmore Palace were accustomed to receiving documents from her, not her person. "Miss Voss," he said, in the tone of someone hoping she would hand him a folder and leave. "I need 5 minutes before the session opens," Clara said. "I have a concern about the Fenmore authentication. The session begins at 9. I'm aware." She kept her voice level. 5 minutes. She was given 3. She stood before the committee, Lord Haversley in the centre, flanked by 2 parliamentary advisers she recognized, and one she did not, and explained without drama and without apology what she had found. She used precise language. She referenced the specific technical indicators. She stated clearly that the portrait currently hanging in the East Gallery was not the original Fenmore Commission, and that its use as legal documentation would constitute reliance on fraudulent evidence. There was a silence of approximately 8 seconds. Then Lord Haversley said, "That is a very serious allegation, Miss Voss." "It is a technical observation," she said. "The allegation, if any, would follow from the observation. I'm reporting what the painting shows." The authentication was due at 9 o'clock. It is now, he checked his watch, 9:02. "Which is why I came before 9, Clara said. "I'm asking for a postponement pending independent review." Another silence, longer this time. "The Fenmore family has legal representation present," said one of the advisers. "A postponement at this stage would require a reason," Clara said. "I've provided one." She understood in the following 30 seconds of consultation that she was not invited to participate in, that she had made herself into a problem. She could see it in the way Lord Haversley pressed his fingers together. She could see it in the way the advisers leaned toward each other. What she did not see until she turned to leave was that the door to the committee room had been left slightly open, and that Edmund Ashford was standing in the corridor outside it. He was not looking at her, but he had not moved. The postponement was denied. Lord Haversley delivered the decision with the kind of measured regret that powerful men use when they want to appear reluctant about something they have already decided. The committee would proceed as scheduled. Miss Voss's concerns were noted. An internal review of the authentication process would be initiated at a later date, through proper channels, and if any irregularities were substantiated, the matter would be revisited. The word revisited landed in Clara's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She returned to her office. She sat at her desk for approximately 90 seconds, which was longer than she usually permitted herself for reactions that served no practical purpose. And then she opened her satchel and removed the 6 pages of notes and the photographs and spread them across the desk, and began to think about what else she could do before the session concluded at noon. There were, she calculated, 3 people in Whitmore Palace who had both the standing to force a procedural halt and the independence from the council to have a reason to use it. One was in Brussels until Thursday. One was the kind of man who believed that institutional process was more sacred than institutional accuracy. The third was Edmund Ashford. She did not want to approach Edmund Ashford, not because she was afraid of him. She was not, particularly, but because going to him meant admitting that the channels available to her had failed, and asking for help from someone who had no reason to give it was a form of vulnerability she had learned through experience to avoid preparing herself for disappointment. She also did not have a better option. She found him in the reading room off the main corridor, seated at a long oak table with a document case open before him, and a posture that suggested he was either reading with extraordinary focus or waiting for something. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. Close, in daylight, Edmund Ashford was not what the word formidable usually conjured. He was not large or physically imposing in the conventional sense. He was, instead, the kind of man who seemed to take up more space than his actual dimensions, because everything about him was deliberate. The way he held himself, the way his attention moved, the way he closed the document he had been reading before she had finished crossing the room, as though giving her his focus was a decision he had already made. His eyes were grey. Not a poetic grey, not the colour of storms or winter light, but the specific grey of someone who had learned to give very little away through expression and had practiced it long enough that it no longer required effort. "Miss Voss," he said, so he knew her name. She filed that. "Your Grace." She placed her notebook on the table. "I'll be direct. I found a forgery this morning in the East Gallery. The committee declined to postpone. The session concludes at noon, and by 1 o'clock, the Fenmore family will have lost a land claim based on false evidence. I have 6 pages of technical documentation and photographic support. I need someone with procedural standing to force an independent review before the session ends." He looked at the notebook. He did not touch it. "Why did the committee decline, de Marin?" he asked. "Because a postponement is inconvenient." "For whom?" She paused. "I don't know yet. Whoever replaced the painting had access to this gallery and enough knowledge of authentication procedure to time the substitution correctly. The committee's reluctance may be coincidental, or it may not be. And you came to me. You have standing on the Parliamentary Oversight Board. A formal request from you would require the committee to halt. It would also require me to take your word for the forgery." "No," Clara said. "It would require you to look at the evidence and form your own conclusion. I'm not asking you to take my word. I'm asking you to read 6 pages of technical analysis and tell me if you find them credible." He looked at her then. Not a glance, a look, the kind that felt like being measured rather than seen. "Leave the notebook," he said. She did not leave. She stood there while he read, because she was not willing to exit the room and wait in a corridor for someone else to decide what happened next. He did not ask her to sit. He did not acknowledge her presence beyond the initial exchange. He read for 11 minutes, she counted, turning the pages with the careful precision of someone who had learned to treat documents as objects that could be damaged by inattention. When he finished, he closed the notebook. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "The pigment analysis in Section 3, you did this yourself?" "Yes." "You have the equipment?" "I have a portable spectrometer. It's considered an eccentricity." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but a brief, involuntary quality of something that might have been appreciation if he had allowed it to develop fully. "Wait here," he said. He left the room. Clara stood by the table and listened to her own breathing, and did not allow herself to consider what would happen if this also failed. Outside the window, the palace courtyard was filling with mid-morning light. Somewhere in the building, a clock chimed 10:30. She had 90 minutes. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Edmund Ashford, walking down the corridor toward the committee room, passed the door of the East Gallery and stopped, and went in, and spent 4 minutes standing in front of the Fenmore portrait, with his hands behind his back and his face entirely still. And when he came out, something in the way he walked had changed. At 11:43, 17 minutes before the committee session was scheduled to conclude, a formal procedural halt was filed with the Parliamentary Committee by the Office of the Duke of Windermere, citing Section 14 of the Cultural Heritage Oversight Act, a provision that allowed a member of the Parliamentary Oversight Board to freeze any proceeding that relied on cultural documentation pending independent verification. Clara learned about it the same way she learned most things at Whitmore Palace, through the sounds the building made when something unusual was happening. The increased movement in the corridors, the clerk who passed her door at a pace that suggested he had been told to hurry without being told why. The silence that fell over the committee room, followed by voices she could hear but not distinguish. She stayed in the reading room. She had done what she could do. The rest was institutional machinery, and institutional machinery moved on its own rhythm, regardless of whether she watched it. At 12:15, the clerk she had spoken to that morning appeared in the doorway. "The session has been postponed," he said. He delivered this information with the expression of someone who found the entire situation professionally destabilizing. "An independent authentication panel has been requested. The council has been notified." "Thank you," Clara said. "Lord Haversley has also—" The clerk paused, reconsidered. "There will be an internal review of the gallery access records." "That seems appropriate," she said. He left. She remained at the table for a moment, her hands flat on the surface, and allowed herself one full breath of something that was not quite relief. Relief would come later, if the panel confirmed what she already knew, but was adjacent to it. The practical satisfaction of a mechanism working the way it was supposed to work for once when it mattered. The independent panel was convened 4 days later. Clara presented her findings formally: the notebook, the photographs, the spectrometric analysis, and a supplementary report she had written in the intervening days that traced the technical history of the original portrait through 3 exhibition catalogues and 2 restoration records, establishing a baseline against which the substitution was undeniable. The panel reached its conclusion in 6 hours. The portrait in the East Gallery was a forgery, created no earlier than 18 months ago, and no later than 8 months prior to the committee session. The original Fenmore portrait was located 3 days after the panel's conclusion, in a private storage facility, registered to a property management company with indirect connections to one of the commercial interests competing for the Castervane Railway right-of-way. The name attached to the storage lease was not Lord Haversley's. It belonged to his brother-in-law. Clara did not learn this from the official report, which she received in an envelope through Palace Post. She learned it from a brief article in the morning edition of a legal affairs periodical, 3 weeks after the panel's conclusion, which described the development in the measured language of institutional correction, an irregularity identified, an investigation ongoing. Proceedings in the Fenmore land dispute to be reconvened on the basis of the original documentation. She read the article at her desk, in the northeast corner office, in the morning light that came in at the angle she needed. She had not spoken to Edmund Ashford since the morning she left her notebook on the reading room table. She had seen him once, briefly, at a distance in the main gallery on the day the panel began its work. He had been speaking to one of the panel members, his back to the room. As she passed the doorway, he had turned his head, not to look at her apparently, but in the direction of the corridor, and she had kept walking. That evening, she had been working late in the archive when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside that stopped at her door. She had not looked up from her work. The footsteps had paused for a moment, long enough to be deliberate, she thought, though she was uncertain, and then continued down the hall. She had not allowed herself to think about it more than twice. What she found, the morning after the legal periodical article, when she arrived at her office at 7:50, was a book on her desk. It had not been there the previous afternoon. It was a first edition. She recognized the binding immediately, the specific cloth cover, of a technical monograph on Victorian portraiture published in 1891. Rare, carefully preserved, the kind of object that lived in collections rather than on desks. There was no note. She opened the front cover. In the margin of the title page, in pencil so light it was almost invisible, was a single mark, not words, just the specific annotation symbol used by serious readers to indicate a passage of particular interest. It pointed to the dedication. The dedication read, "For those who look one more time." Clara stood very still for a moment. Then she closed the book, placed it precisely at the corner of her desk, and sat down to begin her work. The Fenmore case was formally resolved on a Wednesday in late October, when the Parliamentary Committee reconvened with the original portrait, returned from the storage facility, authenticated by the independent panel, and reinstated as legal documentation, and voted in favor of the family's land claim by a margin that suggested the prior proceeding had not been as unanimous in its intentions as it had appeared. Clara was not present for the vote. She was, at that moment, in the East Gallery, overseeing the reinstallation of the original Fenmore portrait by the Palace's restoration team. It was meticulous work. The lighting had to be adjusted, the mounting hardware inspected, the surrounding wall surface checked for any damage from the substitution. She had requested to supervise it personally, and the council had agreed with the particular tone of men who have recently been reminded that they sometimes need the people they have been underestimating. The portrait, once rehung, looked exactly as it should have always looked. Lord Aldrich Fenmore, 3rd Earl of Castlevane, regarded the gallery with the mild, self-possessed dignity of a man painted in 1847 by an artist who loaded his brush from the left and pulled the stroke inward toward his subject's center. The light in the East Gallery at this hour was excellent. The colors were precisely what 3 restoration records and 2 exhibition catalogues had led Clara to expect. She stood before it for a long moment after the team had gone. It was, she thought, a competent portrait. Not exceptional. The composition was conservative, the technique accomplished rather than inspired. The value was not aesthetic, but historical. The record of a man who had lived, who had stood still long enough for someone to see him, and whose image had been considered worth preserving. There was something in that, she thought, that she recognized. They've confirmed the right-of-way will not be developed. She did not turn immediately. She had not heard him approach. He moved, she had noticed, with a quietness that seemed less like concealment than like practice, but she was not surprised by his presence. The building had been different since the panel's conclusion, and Edmund Ashford had been part of that difference in ways that were difficult to define precisely, but impossible to ignore. The railway consortium withdrew, she said. Yesterday. Once the documentation irregularity became public, their legal basis dissolved. He came to stand beside her, not beside her exactly, but in the same general orientation toward the painting, which was a different thing. The brother-in-law has resigned his directorship. 2 others are under review. I saw the article. There will be more articles. She looked at the portrait. The Fenmore family doesn't know my name, she said. Not a complaint, an observation. No. That's fine. Is it? She considered this. The outcome is correct. That's what the work is for. He was quiet for a moment. The gallery was very still around them, the kind of stillness that old rooms in old buildings accumulate over decades of housing things that matter. The book, he said. She had wondered if he would mention it. First edition, 1891, where did you find it? The archive collection. 3rd floor, east section. It's been miscatalogued as a secondary reference for 30 years. Someone filed it under general history. A pause. It belongs in technical resources. I'll reclassify it. I thought you might. She turned to look at him then. In the morning light of the East Gallery, he looked like a man who had spent a significant portion of his life in rooms like this one, surrounded by things made with care and preserved with intention, and had learned from them the same lesson she had. That what endures is not always what is loudest, not always what is most visible, but what is made with enough honesty that time cannot reasonably argue with it. His expression was composed, as it always was, but there was something at the edges of it, not warmth exactly, not the performed warmth that people in this building deployed like currency, but something more durable than warmth, something that had been there, she thought, since the morning she had placed a notebook on a reading room table and told him she was not asking him to take her word for anything. The council is reconsidering my title, she said. Apparently senior authenticator, first class is considered insufficient given recent events. There's talk of a formal directorship. How do you feel about that? I feel that it will give me access to the procurement budget, which means I can finally replace the portable spectrometer with a fixed installation on the 3rd floor. He looked at her. And, she said, that it's probably overdue. Probably, he agreed. They stood together for a moment longer in front of the portrait of Lord Aldrich Fenmore, who had looked at the world with mild and steady dignity for 140 years and given no indication of finding the experience remarkable. There's a collection in the North Wing, Edmund said, that hasn't been properly authenticated since 1974. The cataloguing is significant in its inaccuracy. I'm aware, Clara said. I've been requesting access for 2 years. I sit on the Cultural Heritage Committee. I could arrange a formal review. That would be useful. It would require a lead authenticator with full technical authority. She looked at the portrait. It would, she said. The morning light moved across the canvas in the unhurried way that light moved in rooms that had housed important things for a long time, slowly, without performance, illuminating what was already there. "I'll have the relevant paperwork sent to your office," Edmund said. "Third floor, northeast corner," Clara said. "The radiator no longer makes that sound in case anyone told you otherwise." He said nothing, but when he turned to leave, there was something in the way he walked that was different from every other time she had observed him crossing a room. Something almost, but not quite, unguarded. She waited until his footsteps had faded down the corridor. Then she turned back to the portrait, adjusted one corner of the frame by approximately 2 millimeters, and decided that it was finally exactly right. The East Gallery in late October held the light differently than it did in summer. Clara came back once more after the team had gone and the building had settled into its late afternoon quiet, and stood before the portrait a final time. She did not stay long. She had a North Wing collection to begin preparing for. She picked up her satchel, turned off the gallery lights, and walked out into the corridor, where the afternoon stretched ahead of her, full of work that needed doing in a building that had, in the last several weeks, become slightly more honest than it had been before. She thought that was enough for now. She thought it was, in fact, quite a lot.